Hi, you're about to see a video on speaker break-in, a video where I take 4 new Celestion Vintage 30s and try to break them in and measure what break-in actually is. Don't worry though, this is not a method I used in the test. In fact, this is probably just a method to break a speaker. But don't worry, this speaker was already broken, some idiot dropped it. It was me. I'm an idiot. So this is kind of an intro to the intro, an abstract if you will, because this test has been going on for several months now and it's changed a bit throughout. So I thought it's probably a good idea to give you guys a brief summary before all the blah blah starts. So as I said, I took 4 brand new Celestion Vintage 30s and tried to break them in. 2 of these I tried to break in myself with an own method I developed, and the 2 others I sent away for professional break-in services. Yes, you can actually pay people to wear out your speakers. What a time to be alive! I did frequency response measurements using Room EQ Wizard for each speaker at the beginning and at the end of the respective break-in process, as well as reamped a riff so that we can A/B listen to some samples afterwards to find out if we can actually hear what the graphs show. That is, if they show anything at all. For the speakers I broke in myself, I did these measurements and reamps throughout the process to see if we can see some kind of progression as well. But we'll get to that later. Also, at the end of the day, unfortunately, I am an engineer, and as such, I treated this as a bit of an engineering process. Unfortunately for you, that means there's going to be a lot of talking about the premise, like what is speaker break-in believed to be, and talking about my testing methods and measurement processes, as well as looking at graphs, interpreting, and speculating a bit too. So there will be some listening, but not that much. Now, I understand that might not be thrilling to a lot of people, and some people just want to hear the end result, and I've got you covered too. To help you navigate, I've added timestamps in the description below, so please feel free to jump to the parts you're interested in and skip the parts you're not. I hope you enjoy the video. Speaker break-in, is it fact or is it fiction? In this video, I try to find out through means of testing. Now, if you know me, you know I've been on a Vintage 30 quest for quite some time now. I've investigated almost all of the myths I know about that speaker, apart from speaker break-in. Of course, that isn't limited to Vintage 30s, that extends to all guitar speakers. If you don't know me, I'm a lunatic with an obsessive personality and apparently a debilitating spending habit. I've done a 50+ Celestion Vintage 30 shootout employing methodologies I learned from my former job as a test engineer, as well as a deep dive on the new Vintage 30s and some other videos. If that sounds interesting to you, I'll link a playlist somewhere on screen right now. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about what speaker break-in is claimed to be. Many people on the internet claim that when they first got their speakers, let's say Vintage 30s, they sounded awful to them at first. But after several hours of playing them, they smoothed out and started sounding much more pleasant to them. The reason for this being they broke in, they wore in, they lost some high end, the bass went up, you name it. Other people claim that this is merely a trick of the ear, or more the mind I should say, and that the player merely got used to the sound of their speaker over time. And honestly, I'm not quite sure where I stand on this debate. On the one hand, I myself haven't had the experience of noticing speaker break-in, and I know how tricky the mind can be. I for one need a reference sound mere seconds after hearing a sound sample in order to evaluate it correctly, which is why I add these toggling sections to my amp comparison videos, because if I pause a track to load up a different one, by the time that's playing, I've forgotten what my reference, or in this case the sample, actually sounds like. On the other hand, I do trust what experts in this field have said. I'm thinking of Ignacio from Jensen Speakers, or Nolly in their interviews with Christian Kohl on his YouTube channel. One analogy that keeps being brought up in this entire discussion is leather shoes, which can be uncomfortable and downright painful to wear at first, but as you wear them, they gradually become softer and more comfortable. But the cones in our speakers aren't made of leather. What I find very interesting is that Ignacio and Molly have quoted vastly different time frames for speaker break-ins in the respective videos. While Ignacio said 20 to 30 hours at a decent playing volume, like band volume, would get you 90% there, Nolly said in his interview that he doesn't believe there's much to be had in the first 100 hours. And I believe through my own testing that I was able to confirm pretty much everything these 2 men have said, apart from speaker break-in, at least not yet. So how could it be that these 2 experts, who have been right about everything else, come to such vastly different assessments? So I'm going to do what I like doing most, and that is speculating on the internet, because I believe they might be talking about different mechanisms. I think it could be possible that the 20 to 30 hours that Ignacio's quoted refer to the mechanism of the suspension becoming more malleable. Is that a word? More compliant. Like, let me grab this speaker here. This isn't a Vintage 30. This is a warehouse guitar speaker, but the mechanics are the same. The suspension is this outside part here, where the cone is attached to the frame up here, and I don't know if you can see that, this yellow stuff down there, the spider. And supposedly these components become more compliant over the time. The time frame stated by Nolly could be in reference to an entirely different mechanism if it exists. I believe it could be that over time, say 100, 200, 300, several hundreds of hours, several years of playing, it could be that the cone itself changes. I mean, the cone is made up of cellulose fibers, paper fibers, and they have a certain stiffness, they have a certain length, and I believe it could be possible that over time, maybe these fibers break. Maybe the cone becomes less stiff over time, which could cause it to lose some high end. But again, I don't know anything about paper or paper derivatives. This is me just speculating. I haven't researched this. My expertise lies somewhere else completely, so please keep that in mind. This could all turn out to be bullshit. This is just a theory of mine. Anyway, let me tell you about my test and show you the setup. Over this past year, I've bought several new Celestion Vintage 30s, two of which were featured in the large 50 plus Celestion Vintage 30 shootout. Those speakers were from 2021 and they were labeled as Speaker 49 and Speaker 50. Later, for the deep dive on the new Celestion Vintage 30s, I bought 4 more new Celestion Vintage 30s, 2 of which were from February 2022 and 2 of which were from December 2022. Of those, I ended up keeping the ones from February and I'll let the ones from December go again. Now, why am I telling you this? Because initially I had only planned to beat the living shit out of one of these speakers, Speaker 50. And as of filming this, that speaker has already been tested for 100 hours. But I noticed a few things about my methodology that could be improved. And it also occurred to me that testing just one speaker doesn't have a lot of statistical relevance. So I'm adjusting my test a bit. So I'm going to include 3 more speakers in my test, so we'll have 4 in total. Speaker 50 will be retired now. It's run 50 hours and we're going to look at that later. Speaker 49 is going into my test and will be run substantially longer. I'm thinking 2, if not 300 hours. And the 2 2020 Vintage 30s will be sent away for professional break-ins. But before we get into that, let me show you my test setup here. At the heart of my test is this beautiful Grossmann SG ISO cab in which the speaker is placed with an SM57 which is tightly secured using the world's finest engineering material, copious amounts of tape. To break the speaker in, I'm using a DI loop of me practicing guitar really badly. It's about 20 minutes long and I mean it, it's embarrassing. The DI of that is sent out of output 3 of this Audient ID14 Mark II through this Palmer Da Capo reamp box into this Dietzel VH4 preamp pedal, and from there on into a Seymour Duncan Powerstage 170, which is connected to the speaker in the ISO cab. And as you can see, I've taped down all the pots and settings to ensure that nothing moves. To monitor the speaker's break-ins so far, I've reamped a riff through this setup, and I will also replug it here to connect an output of the interface directly to the Seymour Duncan Powerstage 170 and run Room EQ Wizard frequency response graph sweeps at the start and the end of every test day. I would run this setup during my home office time for work and generally when I was home during the day. So sometimes it would run for just a couple of hours a day and other times it would run up to 10 or even 12 hours a day. So speaker 50 is going into the ISO cab next and it's going to get the living shit beaten out of it for 2, maybe 300 hours with an optimized method. So that leaves the 2 2022 speakers. I'm sure you're wondering what the plan is with those. Now, there is the possibility that my test setup simply isn't suitable for breaking in the speakers. Initially, I was going to use an orange Micro Terra to break in the speaker, and I wanted to measure its output with a scope and a load resistor to approximate the power that would be going to the speaker, but in doing so, I somehow fucked it. So I've moved on to this setup here. in order to at least somewhat get a feeling for the power going to the speaker, I bought a cheap sound pressure level meter off Amazon, and I'm going to test that with the ISO cab open. I don't think my setup is unsuitable because it's loud as balls. Even with the ISO cab closed and several thick blankets over it, I can still hear the music outside. So but you never know, it might still not be loud enough. Luckily, in Germany, there are at least 2 retailers that offer professional break-in services. One of these companies is Tubetown, where I like to buy vacuum tubes. They offer a speaker break-in service that they say is the equivalent of 24 hours of continuous use. And the other retailer is Captain Guitar Lounge. And they're a bit more specific with their setup. They offer 2 different packages. One is 24 hours and one is 72 hours, where they say they run the speaker at 50% of the load it is rated at. So for a Celestion Vintage 30, it'll be running at 30 watts for 72 hours. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? That's right, I'm going to send one of the 2022 speakers to Tubetown and one of the 2022 speakers to Captain Guitar Lounge. Of course, I'm going to make frequency response graphs and reamp before I send them there. And when I get them back, they'll be tested the same way. Neither of these retailers know I'm going to be doing that, so I'm very curious to see what happens or how that sounds. So yes, you lucky people, I'm actually investing my own money for somebody to fuck up my speakers. So do me a favor, click this video maybe 10 to 100 times so I make some money back on this. Thank you. Here's speaker 49. It's about to be tortured for 200 to 300 hours, which will probably take a month or two. So with a bit of luck, I'll see you guys in December for an evaluation. See you on the other side. Alright, it's late December, it's going to be a tight one to get out this year, but we're about to get to the juicy bit. But before we do, let me tie up a few loose ends. I mentioned in the part before that speaker 49 was running with an optimized test setup, but I didn't say how I optimized it. Well, actually I did, but I cut it out because it was getting far too long-winded. Here's the shorter version. This is the interface I used for the test, which is an Audient ID14 Mark II. And I used 2 separate outputs for this. One output for the actual reamping and the actual breaking in with guitar noise, and another output for the room EQ frequency response sweeps. I used output 3 for the amp sounds, which was set to DAW through in the software, which includes output 4. And I set the levels up in Reaper and with the reamp box for the actual amp parts. And when I used output 4 for the frequency response measurements first, it almost blew off the charts. It was much too loud, which freaked me out. So I switched over to output 2 here, which was not set to DAW through, but linked to this little knob here. And that meant every time I was going to do a frequency response measurement, I had to set this manually. Luckily, the Audient interfaces have these handy little LEDs here, and the knob here is kind of notched, so it's fairly easy to set the same level every time. However, to my taste, this left too much room for human error, and I wanted to change that for the second speaker, speaker 49. So I went into the Room EQ Wizard settings and set the sweep level in the software. I went back to output 4. I think I set it to minus 33 dB because otherwise it would have been much too loud. So that's the first change I did. The second improvement concerns the power amp. For the first speaker, speaker 50, I was making reamps and Room EQ Wizard measurements at the start and at the end of every test day because I wanted to collect as much data as possible in order not to miss anything. And that's where I noticed something. On days where the setup was running particularly long, like 10 or 12 hours, frequency response measurement at the end of the day was pretty different than it was at the start of the day. And the next morning it was back to normal again. I suspect that had something to do with heat buildup in the power amp. Probably nothing to do with the speaker. Regardless, that doesn't really matter where it came from. The thing is, nobody's going to warm up their recording or live playing setup for 10 or 12 hours before playing it. It was back to normal again the next day. However, this did lead to some slight trust issues with the Seymour Duncan Powerstage 170, which is why I introduced a second power amp for speaker 49. So I'd be using 2 power amps for the reamps and the frequency response measurements. And I wasn't doing them as frequently because I also standardized my sampling process. For each power amp, I would start off, I'd turn it on, and then I'd play my little reamp riff 10 times through it to hopefully get the respective power amp up to operating temperature. Then I would reamp the riff. Then I'd replug for the frequency response measurements and do those. I start with the KSR, do that, then move on to the Seymour Duncan Powerstage and do the same thing, and then start the break-in day. So those were the quick improvements. Let's dig into some graphs. I want to look at speaker 50 first, which ran for 100 hours and had a lot of samplings done to it. But before I did that, I wanted to make sure that my power amp, my setup, delivered consistent results. So I did several frequency response sweeps after each other on 2 separate days, I believe. What you're seeing on screen now is the first one I did, ranging from 20 to 20,000 hertz. Let's add a second one in, and it's right on the money. Third one, still the same. These are overlaid, these are laid over each other. A fourth one, and then the next day I did another one. And here's where we see some slight variance here. We have a little shift in this bump at about 100 hertz. And yeah, we see some minor differences here. So that's the level of variance we can expect between different days. That's not too much, I can live with that. All right, speaker 50. I've loaded up a few of the sweeps I did for speaker 50 here. I'm not gonna bore you with a sweep every hour. So this is where we started at 0.25 hours, not 0 hours, because I got excited and started the test before doing a sweep and a reamp. 15 minutes in, I noticed what I'd forgotten and I redid the sweep. And yeah, looks pretty normal here. Let's see how it looked after 35 hours. Not a huge change so far. We see that some of the peaks and valleys up here in the high mids have started to shift a bit. And there's a little difference here in the presence. The presence is coming up. The low end and the low mids and the mid mids, they're pretty much the same as they were before. Let's see how it looked after 44.5 hours. Still, nothing much happening. 57 hours. I'm going to unclick the ones between 57 and 0, or 0.25. And we see this trend kind of continues here. The peaks and the high mids are shifting more, and the presence, for some reason, is coming up. So the opposite of what we would expect for break-in. We'd expect the high end to roll off and the low end and the mids to come up. The next one I have is 88 hours. Again, not much has happened there. 95. And it looks to me like the trend is continuing a bit. We see ever so slight shift in the high mids and the presence is coming up a bit. Let's unclick 57. 100 hours. And again, we can see just the tiniest bit of difference here in the high mids, peaks and valleys have not shifted further so far. I'm going to unclick 95 because it's just confusing. Unfortunately, these are the same color, but the presence, the highs, they've come up noticeably here. What do we have here? That's 97, 98 decibels against 95. So 3 decibels difference in that particular frequency band here. So far, so good. Now, let's look at speaker 49, which ran for 300 hours. Now, the sweeps I did with that speaker were far less frequent because, of course, I was looking at these graphs as I was doing them, and not much happened in the first 40, 50 hours. The shifts started to happen at around 50, 60 hours. So, nonetheless, I took a sweep at 38.5 hours. And we see a similar trend as we did before. The low end and the low mids and mid mids, they've pretty much remained the same, but we see these shifts happening here in the high mids, and the presence has come up ever so slightly here. Now the next one I did was at 100.25 hours, and we see the trend continue here. The lower mids or the mid mids have started to do something here. But the biggest difference is, I'm going to highlight this is happening in the high mids and in the presence, which is coming up more. Let's see what happened after 250 hours. Now, it seems that the low end, or the low mids at least, have started to come up ever so slightly. We see something happening here with this valley, and the peaks are becoming more extreme, and the presence is coming up noticeably. I'm going to unclick the ones in between to keep this not so busy. And let's go to 300 hours. Not much difference between 250 and 300 here. I'd say they're pretty much the same. But what I find interesting is that there isn't a huge change in the low end here. Let's look at this 200 hertz. This is 103 decibels versus 102 when we started. So there's about 1 dB difference here between, let's say, 100 and 400 hertz. And it kind of continues here. It gets a little hard to determine in this range here, but in the high mids, a lot has happened here. It's got more spiky. Peaks and valleys have shifted quite dramatically in some cases. And what's most noticeable to me is this big rise in the presence area, the 500 to 600 kilohertz area, which was so crucial in the big V30 test. That was the big differentiator between the early 2000s V30s and the ones that came after that. And this speaker started off sounding smooth in the 5 to 6 kilohertz area, like the early 2000 speakers. But look at this difference. That's about 95 decibels where it is now to before 88.5, if I can read that correctly. So that's 6.5 decibels. Before we move on to the speakers I sent away, let's compare how the KSR power amp performed. The graphs we've seen so far were all made with the Seymour Duncan Powerstage. And if you recall, I said I developed slight trust issues with that. This is a Seymour Duncan speaker 49, 0 hours and 300 hours. We have this slight 1 dB difference here in the low end and low mids, and the presence has come up noticeably, and peaks and valleys have shifted in the high mids. What does the KSR power amp tell us? Paints a very similar picture. It's got a different EQ curve. It's a bit subdued here in the low mids. Sorry. But we see the same thing happening here. There's about 1 decibel difference in the low end and low mids. Gets a little messy here. Peaks and valleys have shifted in the high mids, and the presence has come up noticeably. What do we have here? Almost 96 versus 89.2. So about the same difference. That's good to know. So pretty much confirms what the Seymour Duncan power amp has been telling us. Let's look at the speaker I sent to Tubetown. We see in green the start, that's before I sent it there, and in red how the speaker came back to me. So Tubetown said this was the equivalent of 24 hours of continuous use. And we're not seeing a huge difference here. This blip here at about, what is it, 110, between 110 and 115 hertz has changed a bit. I doubt we'll be able to hear that. Other than that, the speaker is almost the same. We see these ever so slight shifts here between 3 and 4K, as we did with the speakers I broke in. And it seems, again, that the presence, and in this case a bit of the brilliance, has been coming up. But not much has happened yet. I would assume, though, that if it were given the same amount of beating again, that we'd notice more difference. Why would I say that? Because check out the graph of the speaker that went to Captain Guitar Lounge. So again, we see the start in green and the end, meaning when I got the speaker back, in red. We see this difference here in the low end. I wouldn't pay much attention to that because the one at the start, that looks kind of weird. That kind of slipped by me before I sent it out. All the other speakers have kind of behaved like the red one here. I'd ignore everything under 100 hertz here. And we see a bit like the speaker that went to Tubetown, that this dip at 110, between 110 and 120 hertz has shifted a bit, but we see a much bigger difference in this speaker. There's a difference in the low end, which is about 103, about 101.5. So about 1.5 decibels here, starting at 130 hertz, going up to about 430 hertz. In general though, this paints a slightly different picture than the speakers I broke in. It seems that the sound pressure level has gone up by between about half and 1.5 decibels over the entire frequency range, with the exception of the presence area again between 5 and 6 kilohertz. This looks like a bit more. This is about 95 compared to about 92.5, so 2.5 decibels between 5 and 6 kilohertz. Interesting. Now before I conclude and speculate, let's check out Reaper to see if we can actually hear these differences. Let's start with speaker 50, which was the first speaker I attempted to break in with my setup. I've got the reamp track at 0.25 hours here and the final one at 100 hours here. I've loaded up Grossmann Plus here that will show us live FFTs. The green track is always going to be the younger version of the speaker, so without many hours on it, and the blue track is always going to be the older version of the speaker, so this when the speaker has had how many hours of break-in put into it. I'm going to switch back and forth between these tracks using Nugent Audio A/B Assist 2 here. A is always going to be the younger version of the speaker. B is always going to be the speaker when it had more hours on it. Listen to the end again once more. Very subtle to me. There seems to be a slight difference in the high mids and the presence. That's what the graph showed us. What again I like seeing though is that Grossmann Plus, the graphs that Grossmann Plus shows us here line up pretty well with the Room EQ measurement files. Take a quick look here. When the chordy bits come, we see this difference here in the presence, and these difference in high mid peaks, or the shifts I should say. Let's move on to the speaker that showed more noticeably different graphs at the end, which was speaker 49. I've got the speaker track at 0 hours loaded up here and the speaker track at 300 hours here. I would hope that these two tracks would sound a bit more different than the ones before. Let's go. We'll start with the younger and switch back and forth between that and the older version. It seems to me that B, which is the speaker at 300 hours, it sounds a bit brighter, sounds a bit fresher, as if there was a layer removed from over the speakers, like a thin blanket or something like that. Thin blanket. Let's check it out once more time. Yeah, there is a difference. It's noticeable immediately when switching over, but it's kind of subtle. I wouldn't know if that would really affect the tone in a mix all that much. So for good measure, let's check out the speakers I sent in for break-in. Let's start with the one that didn't have such noticeable differences in the graphs, the one that went to Tooptown. Let's go with start with the younger version A again. I don't know, I'm not noticing any difference really. The difference I'm noticing could be imagination, could be suggestion though. And finally, let's check out the one that went to Captain Guitar Lounge. Yeah, again, there's a bit of a difference. I'm sure of that. I can hear that B sounds a bit fuller, but again, the difference is very, very subtle, and it's not something I would notice changing over playing a rig 72 hours. So looking at speaker break-in, where does this leave us? What does this prove? Well, something happens. So it proves that in Celestion Vintage 30, speaker break-in actually happens. The speaker's response changes over use. How exactly? I'm not sure. We're seeing different results here. My break-in pattern looked different to that of the speaker that went to Captain's Guitar Lounge, for example. And I've been thinking about what could be a reason for that. And I assume, and this is again a theory of mine, a theory that belongs to me, once again, that it could have to do with the signal that the speaker is broken in with. Like if you look at my break-in patterns, you see that the most noticeable thing is that the presence come up. The speaker's actually getting brighter rather than smoother, as one would, as the internet myths about speaker break-ins suggest, while the one that went to Captain's Guitar Lounge seems to have become more efficient over the entire frequency range. And I assume that has to do with the signal. If you listen to the guitar tone that I recorded, that was the same guitar tone that was going into the speakers every day for several days. And it's a rather bright tone. It doesn't have an awful lot of low end because it was a bit tricky for me to dial with the preamp pedal in the load box in the room. But regardless, I'm not one who goes for particularly low-end heavy guitar tones. I don't like them that much. I don't hear them very well. I like tighter, brighter guitar sounds. And that is what happened to the speaker. It got tighter and brighter. I could imagine that the guys at Captain Guitars might be using an entirely different test signal. They might be using a guitar track that is pretty even over the frequency spectrum. They might be using a sine wave sweep or pink noise or something. I think though that it might be that the speaker becomes more efficient in the frequency bands that it is driven in, and that would explain why people start liking the speakers they don't like at first. Like say for example, you get a new speaker and it sounds too bright to you, but you're determined to make it work for a while. So what do? On the amp, you either dial the high end down, or you dial the mids and the low end up, or both. Either way, you're going to be driving the lower frequencies, the frequencies that you like, harder than the frequencies that you don't like. So it could be that the speaker becomes more efficient in the frequency bands that you like as a result. But of course, this is just a theory of mine. To prove that, one would have to do more tests. I could take some of the speakers I have here and drive them with an entirely different signal, like a bass signal, and see if the low end comes up as a result. But I don't really feel like doing that. But I'm happy having seen and heard what I've just seen and heard. The speaker's response changes. That is what I wanted to find out. It's not static. Another thing that I'm asking myself now is, does the speaker ever really settle? Like, is it forever changing? Is there a point where the frequencies that we want to hear stop going up and start going down again? Will the speaker fall off a cliff eventually? I think probably it will. It could be that this is never static, that it's an ever dynamic system. But again, this is me speculating. I'm having a bit of fun here. Sorry about that. So yeah, once again, speaker break-in is real, but in my opinion, it doesn't really matter. So on that note, it's time for me to say goodbye for the year. I want to thank you all for watching and checking out my other videos. This has been an amazing year for me on YouTube. The Vintage 30 video really elevated everything I've done so far. The response has been amazing. You guys have been amazing. And I'm very grateful for all you guys' support. It's been really special to me, and it's opened a lot of doors for me. I've been able to speak to a lot of interesting people. I've got the attention of people whose videos I've been watching for years, and that's very surreal to me. Like Leon Todd reaching out for me and getting me on his podcast together with Troy Nababan. That was amazing, and I can't thank those guys enough. Also for the repeated shout outs. Got to talk to Reed Otto of Otto Audio, and he's been great to me too. Eugen Valovita shouted me out in one of his videos and even linked to my videos, which was freaky to me too. I got to talk to Nolly. Nolly reached out to me and we sent a bunch of emails back and forth. They say to never meet your heroes, but Nolly has been nothing but friendly, super articulate and well-spoken, and very generous with his information. And can't say enough good things about all these people. I'm sure I've forgotten a bunch of people because it's been a freaky year. And I've started to ramble, which I didn't really want to. But what I'm meaning to say is thank you guys. I appreciate your support a lot. And yeah, I'm interested to see where this goes. I've got a lot of ideas for next year. I think I want to look at the effect of vacuum tubes in an amplifier in a similar way I've looked at speakers. And of course, I've got a stack of speakers here to check out and do videos for you on. So thanks. Stay tuned. Have a happy new year, because this is probably not going to come out before Christmas, and I'll see you all next year. Thanks. Bye.